She stood at the river crying, and the mountain man put his coat over her. The river wasn't loud, but it was loud enough to drown the sound of her own sobs as she stood at the edge of the bank with her skirt clutched in trembling fingers, cold water soaking the hem as though the land itself tried to pull the grief from her bones. Late afternoon light filtered through the tall pines overhead, turning everything gold except her, because nothing inside her felt warm anymore. Not after walking half a day with blistered feet, not after the wagon that promised her a ride left her far behind without a backward glance, not after the man who said he would marry her turned cruel the moment she told him she had no dowry. She pressed both hands to her face, trying to quiet herself. But the river caught every broken breath and carried it downstream like a confession she couldn't take back. She wasn't sure how long she cried. Not minutes, not hours, just long enough for her vision to blur and her knees to weaken, when a branch snapped behind her with the soft, unmistakable crack of someone stepping out of the timber. She spun, startled, nearly slipping on the wet rocks, but the figure who emerged from between the thick trunks wasn't rushing or shouting or reaching for her like the men who'd scared her off the road earlier. He simply walked with a slow, heavy steadiness, the kind that came from years of carrying the world alone. He was enormous. Broad as the pines he walked past, shoulders wrapped in a thick flannel coat, hair tied back roughly at the nape. Beard wild enough to make him look like the mountains themselves shaped him. A mountain man. The kind people in town whispered about, half in awe and half in fear, as if a man who lived too close to the wilderness must have a wildness in his soul too. But his eyes weren't wild. They were steady, deep brown, and quietly observant, taking in every detail, her shaking, the wet hem of her dress, the bruise along her forearm that she'd tried to hide beneath a rolled sleeve. He stopped a respectful distance away, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, and for a moment he didn't speak at all. He simply looked at her the way no one had looked at her in a long time, like she was a person, not a burden, not an inconvenience, not a problem someone else needed to deal with. "You're cold," he said finally. Voice rough from disuse but gentle in a way that caught her breath. She shook her head, wiping her eyes quickly. "I'm fine," she whispered. I just needed a minute." He didn't argue. He just studied her with that same slow, careful calm. When another gust of wind rolled off the river and struck her, she wrapped her arms around herself instinctively, but the shiver she'd been trying to hide broke through her ribs. The mountain man exhaled once, long, steady, and then shrugged off the coat he wore, the heavy flannel sliding from his broad shoulders with a whisper of fabric and pine scent. She took a step back immediately. "No, I don't need." But he shook his head softly, kneeling so he didn't tower over her as he held the coat out. "Take it," he said, not as a command, not as a favor he expected something for, but like a simple truth the world required. "River'll steal your warmth if you let it." She hesitated, fear and pride tangling in her chest, but the cold bit deeper, and the sincerity in his gaze left no room for doubt. Slowly, trembling, she reached out and took the coat. The weight of it surprised her, warm, thick, smelling faintly of wood smoke and cedar, and when she wrapped it around herself, the heat seeped into her bones like mercy she didn't think she deserved. The mountain man stood again, watching her with the patience of someone who understood storms because he'd weathered them too. "You alone out here?" he asked quietly. She swallowed, unable to lie. "Yes." His jaw tightened, not in judgment but concern. "Then you shouldn't be," he said. "Not by a river, not in these woods. Not tonight." She looked down at the coat wrapped around her shoulders, then at the man who'd offered it without hesitation, and for the first time since dawn, she didn't feel like the world was trying to swallow her whole. She just felt seen. He didn't crowd her or demand answers, didn't reach for her arm or tilt her chin the way other men had done when they mistook her silence for weakness. He simply stood there with the river behind her and the timber behind him, a living barrier between her and anything that might come crawling out of the trees. She kept her arms wrapped tight inside his coat, the heavy fabric almost swallowing her as warmth slowly crept back into her fingers. He noticed how she shifted her weight, how her boots wobbled slightly on the slick stones. "You been walking long?" he asked, voice low like distant thunder. She nodded, looking toward the dirt trail that vanished into the pines. Since sunrise, thought I'd reach town before dark, but... Her voice cracked, and she hated that it did, hated how small it sounded in the vastness of the forest. He took one slow step closer, careful not to startle her. "The trail twists," he said, "and the river pulls sound away, easy to get turned around." She looked at him again, more closely this time. His hair was dark and uncombed, falling in loose waves near his shoulders. His hands were rough, calloused, marked by long days of chopping wood or hauling hides, yet nothing about him felt dangerous, only steady, only grounded. "Did you see anyone else on the road?" she asked, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. His jaw worked as he watched her. "3 men passed earlier," he said. "Not quiet men, rode hard, talked loud." Her stomach turned. They were after me." His posture shifted, not dramatically, just enough to sharpen the air around him. A subtle drop of his shoulders, a grounded widening of his stance, as if preparing for something without fully showing it. "You running from them?" She looked down at the muddy stones beneath her boots. "I'm running from a mistake," she whispered. "One of them said he'd marry me, said he'd protect me. But when he realized I wasn't bringing a dowry, he—" She stopped, her voice failing her as the memories clawed up her throat. The mountain man didn't press. He waited quietly, the river carrying the silence between them like a gentle promise instead of a threat. She swallowed, pushing the next words out. "He told the others I owed him, that I needed to be taught a lesson. They weren't far behind when I reached the woods." His gaze hardened, not at her, never at her, but at the idea of what those men wanted to do. "Men like that don't get to teach lessons," he said. "Only think they do." Her breath shuddered. "I didn't know where else to go." He lifted his chin toward the trees. "Well, you won't stay here." Panic spiked in her chest. "If I leave the river, I'll get lost again." He shook his head. "Not if you walk with me." Something in his tone loosened the knot inside her, calm, certain, like the decision had already been made and all she had to do was follow. She hesitated anyway, clutching his coat tighter. "I don't even know your name." "Call me Hawk," he said. "Folks in town use that name more than the one my mother gave me." She blinked. "Hawk?" It suited him, sharp but steady, fierce but controlled. "I'm—" He stopped her with a raised hand. "You can tell me when you want to, not sooner." That simple mercy nearly undid her. Most men demanded names like they were owed them. Hawk treated it like something she could give freely, not something he could take. A cold breeze rolled off the river again, and she shivered despite the coat. Hawk noticed immediately. "Cold gets worse when the sun drops," he said, "and night in these woods isn't kind to anyone." He stepped aside, tilting his head toward the trail. "There's a place not far. A cabin, fire, shelter, food. You'll be safe there." Safe. She hadn't heard that word without dread in so long that it almost didn't seem real. But the way he said it, firm, certain, a promise rather than a possibility, sparked a thin, trembling strand of hope inside her chest. She drew one more breath, looked at the river that had caught her tears, looked back at the man who had stepped out of the timber like the mountains themselves had sent him, and she nodded. Hawk dipped his head once, acknowledging her choice, then moved in front of her, placing his broad frame between her and the darkened trail ahead. "Stay behind me," he said, and for the first time that day, she stepped forward without fear. The trail swallowed them quickly, the river fading behind them until it was only a distant murmur woven through the trees. And though she tried to keep her footsteps light, the forest floor betrayed every tremble in her legs as leaves crackled under her boots. Hawk walked just ahead of her, moving with a patient steadiness that made the shadows seem less threatening, stopping every so often to glance back and make sure she hadn't fallen too far behind. The deeper they went, the thicker the pines grew, towering overhead like guardians with branches stitched across the sky, letting thin threads of dying sunlight spill down in narrow stripes that painted Hawk's shoulders gold. She hugged his coat tighter around herself, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and cedar that clung to it, a scent that wrapped around her like someone saying, "You can rest now," even though she wasn't resting. Her legs hurt, her throat burned from crying, and every crack of a twig made her flinch. Hawk noticed each flinch without calling attention to it. When she tripped on a hidden root, His hand shot back instinctively, steadying her with fingers warm and rough from years of building, chopping, hauling. "Trail gets narrow here," he murmured. "Stay close." She did. She stayed so close she could hear the soft brush of his sleeve against the branches, could match her footsteps with his rhythm. And slowly, slowly, the panic in her chest loosened its grip. "How far is your cabin?" she asked, voice still thin. Hawk nodded toward the slope ahead. "Up the rise. Set back a ways so the wind doesn't tear at it." She tried to imagine a cabin hidden out here in all this quiet wilderness. "You live alone?" He didn't answer right away, and she worried she'd pried where she shouldn't have, but then he said, "People came and went once, but loss has a way of making a man prefer the trees." She lowered her gaze. "I understand that." "I know you do," he replied, not unkindly, and the simple acknowledgement pierced her deeply, not because it hurt, but because it felt like someone was finally seeing the truth she'd been forced to hide. They continued in silence for several minutes until the trail widened near a fallen log, its bark stripped clean by time and weather. Hawk paused, scanning the distance with the instinct of a man who trusted the land more than he trusted people. "You said they were after you," he murmured. "Those men. They mean trouble." Her breath hitched. "Yes." "Then trouble knows the road," he said. "But trouble doesn't know these woods like I do." She found herself believing him, partly because of his confidence, partly because of the way he planted himself between her and every hollow in the timber that might hide danger. The forest began changing as they climbed higher. The air cooled, the scent of pine grew sharper, and the light dimmed until even her own breath looked pale in front of her. She stumbled again, exhausted, and this time Hawk didn't offer only a hand. He turned fully toward her, his broad frame blocking the wind sweeping down the ridge. "You're shaking," he said. She looked away, embarrassed. "I'm trying." "You're doing more than trying," Hawk said. "You're still standing." World throws a lot at a woman before she ends up crying by a river alone. The words landed softly but firmly, and instead of shrinking from them, she let herself breathe them in. "You don't even know what happened," she whispered. "You don't need someone else's version for your story to count," he replied. "Pain speaks for itself." She swallowed, nodding, emotion tightening her throat. Hawk stepped aside again, just enough to keep the path ahead visible. "Cabin's close now," he said. "Smoke'll be rising from the chimney soon as I get a fire lit." She followed him up the final stretch, the ground leveling as they reached the crest of the ridge, where the trees opened just enough to reveal a dim outline of a small cabin tucked between boulders and thick pines, sturdy, weathered, built with a care that told her Hawk had put every beam in place with his own hands. "This is it," he said quietly. And when she looked at the cabin, alone, steady, waiting, she realized she'd been holding her breath for miles, because for the first time all day, safety didn't feel like a fragile hope. It felt real. Hawk pushed open the cabin door with the gentleness of a man who remembered what it meant to return to silence after too many hard days, and the warm, smoky air spilled out instantly, smelling of cedar logs and something faintly sweet, dried berries maybe, pulling her forward like a hand on her back. She stepped inside hesitantly, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the soft glow of the single lantern hanging from a wooden peg, its light scattering across the simple room. A sturdy table, a pot hanging above the fire pit, a shelf crowded with tools, traps, and jars of herbs, and a neatly made bed tucked against the far wall beneath a heavy wool blanket. The place looked lived in but not cluttered, built for survival, but kept with the careful respect of someone who understood what it meant to lose spaces that once felt safe. Hawk hung his bow on a peg near the door and crossed to the fire pit, his movements slow, deliberate, creating sparks with practiced ease until flames licked upward and cast their warmth across the cabin. She hovered near the door, unsure whether she should sit or stand or run or fold into herself completely, and Hawk noticed, because he always noticed. He pointed to a wooden chair beside the fire. "Sit. Warm yourself." She obeyed before she even realized she had moved, lowering herself into the chair as the flames breathed heat into her bones. The coat he'd given her still wrapped around her shoulders, heavy and comforting, and for a moment she felt almost disoriented by the sudden safety of it all. No shouting, no footsteps chasing her, no hands grabbing, just the crackle of the fire and the quiet sounds of Hawk moving about the cabin. He ladled water into a tin cup, added dried herbs, and set it near the flames to steep. Only when he finally sat across from her on a low wooden stool did she feel the weight of his attention, the kind that wasn't demanding, wasn't prying, just steady and patient, making it impossible to hide behind silence any longer. "Tell me what happened," Hawk said softly. Not an order, not pressure, just a place where truth could land. She tried to speak, but the first attempt caught in her throat. She swallowed, tried again, and the first word slipped out as barely a whisper. "I thought he loved me." Hawk didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't shift his gaze. That helped. So she continued. "His name is Eli. He said he wanted to marry me, said he'd take care of me, keep me safe." Her hands tightened around the coat. "But when he learned I had no dowry, no land, he said I'd misled him, that women like me didn't get to choose who they married, that he'd paid for the wagon ride, the food, the space beside him, so I owed him." Hawk's jaw tightened, but he kept still. She forced the rest out. "When I tried to leave, he grabbed my arm so hard I thought the bone would crack. He told the others, friends of his, that I was running from a promise, that they needed to help him bring me back to my senses." Her voice trembled. "They laughed, said a woman alone on the road won't make it unless a man keeps her in line." She shook her head, heat rising behind her eyes. "I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. I thought if I reached the station early, maybe a wagon would take me the other way, but Eli and the others were close. I hid in the woods. I heard them shouting they'd find me, that nobody would protect a woman who walked away from a man's claim." The tears she'd been trying to swallow came back up, spilling hot down her cheeks despite her efforts to hold them back. "I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what else to do." Hawk didn't interrupt, didn't rush to comfort her. Instead, he rose slowly, stepped to the shelf, pulled down a folded blanket, and draped it around her shoulders with gentle, deliberate hands, hands that asked for nothing. "Men like Eli don't love anything," Hawk said quietly. "They possess. There's a difference." She looked up at him, eyes shining in the firelight. "What if he finds me?" Hawk crouched down, bringing himself level with her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You're not standing by a river anymore," he said. "You're not alone in the dark." He placed one warm, solid hand on the arm of her chair, not touching her, but close enough to anchor her. "If he comes here," he murmured, "he won't reach you." A breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding left her chest in a shaky exhale, and for the first time, she believed it. The fire had settled into a steady glow by the time her breath finally evened out, the trembling in her hands easing beneath the blanket Hawk had draped over her shoulders, and for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the night passing quietly, just the crackle of wood, the soft whistle of wind against the cabin walls, Hawk's steady presence nearby. But quiet in the wilderness was rarely real silence, and Hawk heard the change in the world before she did. His head lifted, eyes narrowing slightly as he turned toward the door, body tensing in a way that made the hair on her arms rise. She straightened immediately. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer. Not yet. Just moved toward the lantern, lowering its flame with a practiced twist of his fingers until the cabin dimmed to a warm shadow. Only the fire remained lit, glowing low and steady as he stepped to the window, lifting two fingers to slightly tilt the hide curtain. He watched the woods, like a man who'd spent years learning the difference between natural night sounds and threats disguised as them. Then he exhaled. "Riders," he murmured. Her breath stalled. "Eli." "Maybe," Hawk said. "3 horses. Same number you mentioned. They're moving slow." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "They found me." Hawk shook his head as he reached for his boots. "They found a trail. That's not the same thing." But the tension in his shoulders told her he wasn't taking chances. He crossed the cabin in long, silent strides, pulling a rifle from the wall and checking it with the quiet ease of a man who rarely used violence unless he had no choice. He wasn't performing for her, wasn't trying to impress, just preparing like someone who protected before he questioned. She rose to her feet, panic clawing up her throat. "Hawk, I don't want anyone hurt because of me." He turned, meeting her gaze with the force of steady ground. "Nobody gets hurt unless they try to reach you," he said. "And even then, I'll decide how far things go." The calm in his voice should have frightened her, but it didn't. It steadied her. He moved to the door, cracking it just enough to feel the air. The night breeze carried the faintest tremor of hoofbeats, distant but real. He nodded once, confirming what he'd already sensed. "They're following the lower trail," he murmured. "They'll reach the ridge soon." She stepped closer, drawn toward him without thinking. "Will they see the cabin?" "Not from the ridge," he said. "But they'll smell the smoke if they get too close." Her chest tightened. She gripped the blanket tighter. "I can leave," she whispered. "I can hide. I don't want this on you." Hawk turned fully, and the look he gave her rooted her to the floor. "You ran long enough," he said softly, "and you won't run again tonight." Before she could respond, the distant hoofbeats grew louder, still far, but no longer fading. Hawk opened the door wider, stepping out onto the small porch, the moonlight carving his broad frame into a silhouette that looked carved straight from the stone cliffs behind the cabin. She hesitated only a moment before following him outside. The night was cold enough for her breath to show, and the blanket tugged tight around her didn't stop the chill of fear from sinking into her bones. Hawk scanned the tree line, eyes narrowing as he located the rhythm of the approaching horses. "Stay behind me," he said again, voice unshaken, "and don't move unless I tell you." She obeyed without argument, the rough boards beneath her boots creaking as she stepped closer to his back. He didn't turn, but something in his posture shifted, steadying, grounding, as if her presence behind him mattered more than the danger in front. The hoofbeats grew louder until she could hear the huff of the horse's breath, the snap of twigs under hooves, the low murmur of male voices carried by the wind. Hawk stepped off the porch and planted himself at the edge of the clearing, legs braced, rifle resting loosely in his hands, not raised, not threatening, just visible enough to stop foolishness before it started. The riders emerged through the pines seconds later, 3 silhouettes, just as Hawk predicted. Eli's voice cut through the darkness first, dripping with false confidence. "That's the cabin. She has to be here." Her stomach twisted painfully, but Hawk didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't let them step closer. He spoke first, voice carrying like a warning layered into the night. Trails closed. The horses halted, startled by the force of it. Eli leaned forward in his saddle, trying to see through the dark. "Who the hell are you?" Hawk lifted his chin, the moon catching the edge of his jaw. "The man standing where you don't get to walk." Silence fell, sharp, cold, final, and for the first time since Eli began hunting her, she felt the fear shift from her shoulders to his. Eli's horse stamped restlessly beneath him, picking up on the tension rolling off Hawk like heat from a forge. And though Eli tried to square his shoulders and draw himself tall in the saddle, the night laid his fear bare. Every twitch of his jaw, every dart of his eyes toward the shadows where the trees closed in tight. "I'm here for what's mine," he said, voice louder than his courage, and she flinched at the familiar ugliness of the word, but Hawk didn't even blink. He stood in the clearing with the ease of a man who knew the land beneath his feet and trusted it more than the men on horseback. "You don't own a damn thing," Hawk replied, lifting the rifle just enough that its gleaming barrel caught the moonlight, not aiming it, just reminding Eli he wasn't dealing with a man who relied on threats alone. Eli's friends shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another with the growing realization that whatever they expected to find at the end of the trail, it wasn't a solitary giant of a man carved from cedar and stone, standing unshaken in the dark. Eli pointed toward the cabin. "She lied to me. She promised herself to me. I have a right to bring her back." Hawk took one slow step forward. She felt it from the porch, felt the ground almost answer him, the steady weight of his stride carrying more authority than any lawman Eli had ever blustered in front of. "A promise made under fear," Hawk said, "isn't a promise. It's a threat wearing church clothes." Eli's face reddened with humiliation, but Hawk wasn't done. "You hurt her," he said, voice lowering. "You chased her. Drove her into the woods like she was prey." One of the riders swallowed hard. "Eli, maybe we should just—" "Shut up," Eli snapped, but his voice cracked at the edges. "You don't know what she's like. She twists things. She makes people feel sorry for her." Hawk's jaw set, and when he stepped forward again, Eli's horse skittered sideways. I've seen what she's like, Hawk said. Cold, scared, exhausted, but standing. That's more than I can say for a man who needs two others to help him drag a woman back to a life she didn't choose. She couldn't see Hawk's face, but she knew by the tremor in Eli's posture, by the way the night itself thickened, that his eyes were steady, and that steadiness terrified Eli more than any raised weapon ever could. "You think you can hide her from the law?" Eli shouted. "From the preacher? From the whole damn town?" Hawk didn't bother answering that with words. Instead, he planted himself in front of the porch, body fully blocking the sight of her, and it hit her with a force that turned her knees weak. Hawk wasn't protecting her because she was helpless. He was protecting her because he'd decided she deserved that protection, human protection, decent protection, the kind no one had ever offered her without strings or demands. Eli tried to muster a new kind of anger, false anger, forced from pride instead of power. "Move," he barked, "or I swear I'll—" Hawk lifted the rifle, not high, not fast, just enough to silence the rest of the threat. "You won't swear anything," Hawk said. "Not to me, and sure as hell not to her." The clearing fell quiet, so quiet she could hear the river in the distance again. One of Eli's riders finally found his courage, not to fight, but to speak truth. "Eli, this ain't right," the man muttered. "You said she owed you because she didn't have a dowry? That's not how folks work. Ain't never been." Eli glared at him, humiliated. "So you're taking her side now?" The man hesitated. Then, "No, I'm taking the side that doesn't get me killed by a man twice your size." Eli's face went pale. "We can come back with the sheriff," he tried, but even that lacked bite. Hawk lowered the rifle slightly, though his stance didn't relax. "Bring whoever you want," he said. "Just know, no law sees a woman as a man's property out here unless the man holding the law wants to." He let the words hang, heavy as the mountains behind them. "And you'd better pray the sheriff is a better man than you." Eli's horse sidestepped again, inching backward as if the animal itself had drawn the line. Finally, Eli yanked the reins, voice cracking. "This isn't over!" Hawk didn't even answer. He simply stood there, unmovable, watching until Eli and his riders finally turned their horses and retreated into the dark pines, the hoofbeats fading slowly, then completely. She remained frozen on the porch, breath shaking, but the second Hawk turned back toward her, shoulders easing only slightly. She saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Relief, yes, but also a kind of fierce, steady protectiveness that wasn't fading with the danger. Instead, it was settling, rooting, becoming something that felt almost like belonging. And when he walked toward her, lowering the rifle and keeping his voice gentle, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the woods, not of the night, not of tomorrow, not while he stood between her and the world. Hawk didn't speak right away after the riders disappeared into the shadows of the pines. He simply stood there for a long breath, listening to the silence settle, making sure the night wasn't hiding anything else, and only when the last echo of hoofbeats dissolved into the dark did his shoulders loosen enough for him to lower the rifle completely. He turned toward her, and she saw the shift in him, not softer, not exactly, but unguarded in a way that made her chest tighten. "Inside," he said quietly. "Cold's creeping in." She followed him into the cabin, her heartbeat still tangled from fear and relief and something else she didn't yet have a name for. And when Hawk shut the door behind them, the small space felt warmer than any place she had been in months. The fire had burned low but steady, casting long shadows across the wooden walls, and she sank back into the same chair by the hearth as if it had been waiting for her. Hawk moved silently, hanging the rifle back on its peg, checking the window shutters, tightening the latch on the door with a practiced ease that told her he'd done this more nights than she could count. But tonight felt different, because this time he wasn't securing the cabin for himself. He was securing it for her. When he finally sat across from her again, elbows resting on his knees, the firelight flickering across his tired eyes, he exhaled a slow breath. "They won't get far tonight," he said. "River trail's rough in the dark." She swallowed. "Will they come back?" "Maybe," he admitted. "Men like Eli don't take humiliation well." She flinched, and Hawk's voice softened. "But they won't come back here. Not once they've seen what stands between them and you." She looked down at her hands. I'm not used to anyone standing for me. Hawk's brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in a quiet, pained understanding. You should have had that long before today, he said, but you've got it now. The words landed with a force she didn't expect, simple, steady, spoken without hesitation, as if he'd already committed to the idea long before she heard it. And when she lifted her gaze, she found him watching her with the kind of attention that made her feel seen instead of exposed. He didn't fill the silence with questions or pity. He let her breathe, let her exist in the moment without asking her to be strong or grateful or composed. After a long pause, he rose to check the kettle he'd set near the fire, pouring the warmed herbal water into a tin cup. He handed it to her and she wrapped her fingers around it, feeling the heat seep into her palms. Thank you, she whispered. Hawk shook his head lightly. You don't thank someone for keeping you alive, she blinked. Most people expect something for kindness. Then they ain't kind, he said simply. They sat in quiet for a while, listening to the crackle of the fire and the faint sigh of wind slipping through the pines outside. Slowly, the tightness in her chest began to ease, replaced by an exhaustion that felt cleaner, like her body finally believed it wasn't in danger anymore. Hawk noticed the way her head dipped slightly, her shoulders lowering. You need sleep, he murmured. She stiffened. I don't want to take your bed. You won't, he said. I'll take the floor. Hawk, I can't. You can. And you will. His voice wasn't stern, just certain, the same way he'd spoken when he told Eli the trail was closed. She opened her mouth to argue, but the truth settled between them. She was tired, and he would sooner sleep outside in the cold than let her apologize her way back into danger. Finally, she nodded. All right. Hawk nodded once, satisfied, then grabbed an extra blanket from the shelf and tossed it onto the floor near the hearth. But instead of lying down, he opened the door again, just a crack, letting the cold night air sweep in. What are you doing? She whispered. He tilted his head. Checking. She didn't need to ask what. She watched him stare into the woods, silent and evaluating, as if memorizing every possible threat the night could hide. When he finally shut the door and secured the latch again, something in her heart loosened. He wasn't watching the woods because he didn't trust the night. He was watching them because he didn't trust the men who fit its darkness too well. He lay down on the floor near the fire, one arm beneath his head, the flames painting his profile in warm gold. Rest, he said. She settled onto the bed, his coat wrapped tightly around her, and as her eyes drifted shut, her last thought before sleep claimed her was simple, startling, and impossibly warm. I'm safe, because he's here. Morning came gently, slipping through the cracks in the cabin's shutters as thin blades of gold that stretched across the floorboards and crept slowly toward Hawk's sleeping form beside the fire. She woke first, curled beneath his coat, her breath warm against the wool, her heartbeat steadier than it had been in days. For a moment she didn't move, afraid that shifting even slightly might break whatever fragile safety she'd found in the night, but the fire still glowed in soft embers, the cabin still held its quiet warmth, and Hawk, broader than life even while sleeping, rested with one hand near the rifle, like a man whose instincts protected even in dreams. She watched him for a heartbeat too long, caught by the strange ache in her chest, gratitude, relief, and something deeper she didn't dare name yet, before she pulled herself upright. The floor creaked softly, and Hawk's eyes opened instantly, alert but calm as they landed on her. You all right? He asked, voice thick with sleep. She nodded. I slept. The way he nodded back, slow, almost proud, made warmth rise to her cheeks. Hawk rose to his feet in one smooth motion, rolling his shoulders as he crossed to the window and eased the shutter open a sliver. He stilled. His breath changed. What is it? She whispered. Hawk lifted a hand, quiet, steady, motioning her back from the window. They're back, he murmured. 3 riders, same as last night, but they're on foot now, horses tied back in the trees. Her blood chilled. Are they? Hunting, Hawk finished. They're following tracks, yours, mine. He let the shutter drop, brow hardening into the expression she'd begun to recognize, controlled, assessing, not afraid, but calculating the threat like a man weighing a storm. "They'll circle down toward the clearing," he said. "Try to get the high ground on the ridge." Fear surged through her so sharply she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. "Hawk? What do we do?" He stepped to her, close enough that his presence quieted the noise in her chest, and touched the back of her arm lightly, a grounding gesture. "We move before they get the chance," he said. "There's a ridge path behind the cabin that'll take us to a lookout. They can't ambush us there." She swallowed. "I don't want you hurt because of me." He shook his head once. "You didn't bring danger here. Men like them follow their own ugliness." Then he handed her the coat again, not because she was cold, but because he remembered last night. Remembered how she clutched it like an anchor. "Stay with me," he said, "no matter what." She slipped into the coat and followed him out the back door, the cold morning biting at her cheeks as they climbed the narrow trail behind the cabin. The forest felt different in daylight, sharper, thinner, the air tinged with frost, but Hawk moved with confident steps, guiding her over roots and rocky slopes as if he'd memorized every inch of land years ago. Halfway up the ridge, he stopped and crouched, scanning the clearing below. She knelt beside him, breath shaking. Eli and his men moved through the lower brush, eyes wild, weapons drawn, not searching blindly, but tracking with the kind of anger that made her stomach churn. Eli's voice carried faintly through the trees. "She's close. Hawk won't get far with her. I'll drag her out myself if I have to." Hawk's jaw tightened until a muscle ticked along his cheek. "They're not letting go," she whispered. "Not until they're made to," Hawk said, "and I'll make them." She didn't realize she'd reached for his arm until her fingers brushed the fabric of his sleeve. "Hawk, don't kill them. Please. I don't want this to become blood on your hands." He turned his head toward her, eyes deep and steady. "I won't kill unless they force my hand," he said, "but I will stop them." Eli's group paused suddenly, staring at the ridge. One pointed. Tracks, fresh. Hawk grabbed her hand, warm, strong, firm, and pulled her gently but urgently toward the last rise of the ridge. "Come on, Crate," he said. "We end this where the land levels." She followed, breath fast, pulse wild, but the moment they reached the top, a strange stillness washed over her, not peace, but the kind of clarity that comes before a choice. Hawk stood tall beside her, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the trees below. He was preparing for the final confrontation, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't stepping backward from danger. She was stepping forward with someone who refused to let fear decide her fate. And when Eli's shouts rose from the trees, echoing toward the ridge, she felt Hawk's hand brush hers, not by accident, not out of fear, but in a silent promise. This ends today, and you won't face it alone. The ridge opened suddenly into a flat stretch of earth washed in early sun, the golden light spilling across the rocks like it had been waiting for them, and Hawk guided her toward the widest spot, planting himself slightly ahead of her, not blocking her, not shielding her completely, but standing close enough that she felt his steadiness like a second heartbeat. From below, Eli's shouting grew louder as he dragged himself up the trail, snapping branches, cursing the incline, driven by humiliation more than conviction. His two companions followed with far less certainty, glancing nervously at the towering pines and the steep drop to the river below, as if realizing too late they'd backed themselves into land that favored the man they were hunting. Hawk said nothing, didn't raise the rifle, didn't even shift his stance. He simply waited. Calm as the mountain behind him, while she stood beside him, trembling with a courage she had never felt before, her breath sharp in her chest but her feet steady on the cold stone. It struck her then. She wasn't hiding behind him. Not anymore. Eli burst into the clearing first, face slick with sweat, boots sliding on loose gravel as he stumbled into view. "You," he spat, pointing at her like she was a stray animal he meant to corner. "You think you can make a fool out of me? You think anyone's going to protect you from what you owe?" Hawk's voice cut through the clearing, not loud but solid as bedrock. "Stop?" Eli froze for half a heartbeat, but his pride shoved him forward. "This isn't your business. You came into my woods," Hawk said. "You followed her with violence in your hands. That makes it my business." Eli's jaw clenched. "She's mine." Something in her snapped, clean, sharp, like a rope that had been too tight for too long finally breaking. She stepped forward before she realized she was moving, her voice rising with a strength she hadn't known she still possessed. "I was never yours." Eli blinked, taken aback for the first time. She kept going, heart pounding so hard she felt it in her fingertips. "You didn't love me. You didn't want me. You wanted control. You wanted someone who couldn't tell you no." She took another step, Hawk matching her pace without crowding her, staying at her right side like a silent anchor. "You hurt me. You scared me. You tried to drag me into a life I didn't choose. That's not a promise. That's a prison." Eli sputtered, glancing at his men as if begging for backup, but neither of them spoke. They only watched her, wide-eyed, uncomfortable, suddenly aware that they'd been following a man who didn't know truth from ownership. Hawk shifted just enough to draw Eli's gaze back to him. "She stands in her truth now," he said. "You won't touch her again." Eli's face twisted, fury clawing back over his uncertainty. "You think I'm afraid of you?" Hawk didn't answer, not with words. He simply stepped in front of her, broad frame blocking the rising sun for a moment, and lowered the rifle, not to aim, not to threaten, but to make it clear that if Eli moved even an inch toward her, the earth itself would turn against him. "Go home," Hawk said, "before you dig a hole too deep for your soul to climb out of." The wind swept across the ridge then, rustling the pines below, carrying the river's roar faintly upward as if the whole mountain had stopped to listen. Eli's bravado cracked. She saw it, plain as daylight, saw the moment he realized he wasn't facing a frightened girl anymore. He was facing a woman who finally spoke, and a man who would tear down the world to protect her if he had to. "This isn't over," Eli muttered weakly. Hawk's reply was quiet, final. "It is for you." Eli backed away, boots sliding, pride collapsing in on itself. His men followed, one of them shaking his head with a shame that wasn't meant for her, but for the fool he'd followed. When they disappeared down the trail, silence blanketed the ridge, deep, cool, steady. She exhaled shakily, the strength that had carried her through the confrontation draining all at once as her knees wavered. Hawk caught her elbow, not gripping, not steadying by force, but supporting her with the same quiet care he'd shown since the river. "You did that," he murmured. "Not me." Her breath hitched. "I've never spoken to him like that before." "You didn't have the mountain at your back before," Hawk said softly. She looked up at him then, sunlight warming the edges of his wild hair, his steady eyes, his rough jaw, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a thing to be claimed. She felt like a person who had finally claimed herself. Hawk's coat rustled around her shoulders, heavy and warm, and without thinking, she whispered the truth that rose from somewhere deep inside. "I don't want to go back to who I was." Hawk's answer was slow, certain, and gentle as dawn. "Then don't." The sun climbed higher over the ridge, warming the cold stone beneath her boots and softening the tremble still lingering in her legs, and for a long moment she simply stood there beside Hawk, breathing in air that didn't taste like fear anymore. The pines below swayed in a slow rhythmic dance, the river's distant roar settling into something steady, almost peaceful. And when she finally let out the breath she'd been holding since the moment Eli first appeared at the riverbank, it felt like something inside her, something wounded, something long muted, finally loosened. Hawk watched her quietly, his gaze steady but not probing, as if giving her space to feel the weight lifting off her shoulders. When her knees finally softened, he stepped closer without saying anything, and guided her gently toward a smooth boulder near the ridge edge, where the morning sun spilled warm light across the granite. "Sit," he murmured. She didn't argue. She eased onto the stone, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders, the wool smelling like cedar, smoke, and something grounding that she could only describe as him. Hawk remained standing for a moment, scanning the trail below with the vigilance of a man who never fully relaxed while danger still lingered. But the tension in his stance had shifted, not tight, not coiled, but protective in a quieter, settled way. Finally, satisfied the men were gone for good, he lowered himself onto the boulder beside her, his broad frame easing down with a slow exhale. For the first time since she met him, the silence between them wasn't about fear or uncertainty. It was comfortable, full, almost warm. She turned her head slightly. I didn't know I could speak to him like that, she whispered, the memory of her own voice on the ridge still startling. Hawk's lips curved into the smallest, faintest trace of a smile, barely there, but enough to make her chest flutter. You didn't speak to him, he said. You spoke for yourself. That's different. She swallowed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I didn't feel brave. Bravery ain't a feeling, Hawk said quietly. It's a decision you stand in when your legs want to run. She absorbed those words slowly, letting them settle, and then, almost hesitantly, she asked the question pressing hardest against her ribs. What now? Hawk didn't rush his answer. He looked out over the valley, the morning light glazing his wild hair in gold, the wind tugging gently at the loose strands near his jaw. Now, he said, you get to choose what your life looks like, not Eli, not anyone else. She drew the coat closer around herself. And you? His gaze shifted to her, steady, deep, quiet enough to feel like truth. I'll walk with you as far as you want me to, he said. Long as you want me there. Her breath caught, not because of the words themselves, but because no man had ever offered her choice. They offered conditions, demands, ownership disguised as affection. Hawk offered presence, a place beside him, not beneath him. You helped me, she whispered. You saved me, Hawk. He shook his head with a slow certainty. You saved yourself. I just made sure no one cut that chance away. Her throat tightened. I don't know where to go, she admitted. What to do, who I'm supposed to be now. Hawk reached for the coat's collar, gently pulling it higher around her shoulders the way he had the first time by the river, not claiming her, not sheltering her like something fragile, but reminding her she wasn't alone in the cold anymore. You don't have to decide today, he said, and you don't have to decide alone. She surprised herself when she leaned closer, just enough for her shoulder to touch his arm, for her breath to mix with his in the cool morning air. Hawk didn't pull away. If anything, he anchored himself more firmly beside her, letting the quiet settle around them like the start of something new. After a moment, he stood and held out his hand, not commanding, not assuming, offering. She stared at it, heart thudding. That hand had stood between her and danger. It had steadied her in the woods. It had given her warmth when she was cold and strength when she was shaking. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. He closed his fingers around hers, warm, strong, gentle, and pulled her to her feet. Come on, he said softly. Let's go home. Home? She echoed, breath trembling. A place you choose, he said. A place that doesn't hurt. She blinked hard, tears threatening again, not from fear this time, but something overwhelming and new. Hawk guided her down the ridge path toward the cabin, and as they walked, the sunlight seeped through the trees, turning the trail into a soft gold ribbon leading forward. She didn't know what tomorrow looked like. She didn't know what kind of life waited for her, but she knew one thing. When Hawk placed his coat over her again at the cabin door, brushing the fabric lightly at her shoulders with deliberate care, she didn't feel like she was being covered out of pity. She felt chosen. And for the first time, she stepped into a doorway, not as someone running from her past, but as someone walking into her future. Some people spend years standing in cold places, waiting for kindness that never comes, and some find warmth the moment a coat is laid across their shoulders by someone who means it. If this story held your heart for a moment, like, share, and subscribe to Redemption West, where mercy stands tall, justice walks steady, and every soul earns a second sunrise.